Who's ready to evaluate? It's me. Okay, we're going to evaluate. What do we want to evaluate? Let's evaluate the multi-stage fitness test. Okay, so evaluating is literally discussing the advantages and disadvantages. Now, I want to tell you how to cheat here because I do. This is where you start to pull from other places, right? So evaluating the multi-stage fitness test. I want to know two things about this test before I start going into my pros and cons, right? And that's because some pros and cons are universal. So the first thing I want to establish is this a max or a submax test? Is it a field or a lab test, right? So I know, and I'm not writing this down on the IB exam itself. I'm going to store these as little nuggets in my brain. So brain nuggets, right? Include that this is a field test. And it's also a max test, right? This is really going to help me with my advantages and disadvantages because let's get started with advantages, right? One of the advantages is that this is a field test. So it simulates, or so rather, it takes place in the same environment as the sport, right, as the specific sport. So if you're doing a field test and you play soccer, well, soccer's in a field and the test is in a field, right? You're not simulating environmental conditions. You are in the environmental conditions, right? So that's awesome. I also know that because it's a field test, it's probably cheap, right? And you'll use fancy words like inexpensive and accessible to all. So that's exciting, right? What else was I thinking? Okay, it's practical, right? So cheap, and you can use large numbers of people. So this is good for teams, large number of people. Now, if I take a look at this list of advantages I have here, these could also be applied to any other field test, right? They're all going to be in the same environment as the sport. They're all going to be relatively inexpensive compared to a lab test, and they're all good at testing large numbers of people. So my advantages don't really have as much to do with the multi-stage fitness test as they do with the fact that the multi-stage fitness test is a field test. But guess what? The IB is cool with that, so we're going to roll with it. Now let's take a look at disadvantages. Okay, so one of the disadvantages is that it's a predicted VO2 max, right? That's extrapolated from a formula. Okay, this is, so the VO2 max is not being directly measured. You're kind of putting it in a formula. Okay. So other disadvantages, right, is that because it's a max test, there is a greater risk of injury. And it can't be used to test all populations. Because, right, to test like the elderly or children, we would use the Harvard step test. We're not going to use a max test, right? So you can also go into like it's unreliable due to motivation, invalidity due to agility, but really these are the main pros and cons of the test. And really, if we look at it, we can tell pretty easily that they came from the fact that it's a field test and they came from the fact that it's a max test, right? So those are important things to keep in mind. And that, my friends, is evaluating a test. Yeah, so we're talking, we're getting through. What's left? Describe, discuss, cry a little bit.